In this comparative study, I will explore the similarities and differences in the depiction of supernatural phenomena of two iconic films in the horror genre: The Exorcist, a 1973 film directed by William Friedkin, and Hereditary, a 2018 film directed by Ari Aster. The Oxford English Dictionary defines supernatural phenomena as belonging to a realm or system that transcends nature, as that of divine, magical, or ghostly beings. Indeed, both films exhibit terrifying demonic possessions and paranormal activity. Despite their frightening nature, these films have left a lasting mark on audiences and critics alike, with The Exorcist earning a reputation as one of the scariest movies in history, and many considering Hereditary as this generation's equivalent.
The attack is psychological, Damien.
These films were chosen due to their significance to the film industry, popular culture, the horror genre, and their ability to offer disturbingly visceral cinematic experiences in different historical, cultural, and socio-religious contexts. Specifically, I aim to examine themes such as faith, the occult, demonic possession, and their effects on the psychological states of both the characters and the audience. The Exorcist uses religious iconography to tell a story about expelling a demon,
That the power of Christ compels you!
while Hereditary uses imagery of the occult to summon a demon. What is most scary about these films is their initial focus on the ordinary world. The Exorcist and Hereditary devote significant screen time to establishing the average life in a world already ridden with grief and despair. The supernatural world in these films is merely a reflection of the natural world, enhancing realism and making the horror all the more terrifying. While the films do rely on conventional horror tropes to convey the more gruesome subjects, they develop a morbid fascination with ordinary people, only to have their lives ruined and sometimes ended, ultimately succumbing to the supernatural. The Exorcist centers on the possession of a young girl named Reagan and the efforts of her mother and two Catholic priests to save her soul. As her condition worsens, Reagan's mother looks beyond medical explanation and seeks religious intervention. In a disturbing and intense 20-minute-long exorcism that shocked audiences, the demon is cast out from Reagan's body, resulting in the death of both priests. According to Sidney Ostrom, a professor of church history at Yale, the 60s decade did experience a fundamental shift in American moral and religious attitudes. As The Exorcist began filming in 1972, this was a time of great cultural and political upheaval. Amidst the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Sexual Revolution, Americans revolted against institutional authority, particularly in the Catholic Church. At this time, many turned away from theology or God-centered relations and sought progress through institutional change. Some perceived this shift of political liberalism and cultural radicalism as the death of God. We can see this radical nature of the 60s and 70s reflected in The Exorcist. Taking inspiration from earlier psychological horrors such as Rosemary's Baby and The Shining, Hereditary revolves around the Graham family, who grieve the deaths of their grandmother and daughter. After conducting a seance to conjure the spirit of the daughter, the family realizes that the grandmother was a devout cult follower of Paimon, one of the kings of hell. In a terrifying turn of events, the family discovers that they are cursed, and the cult begins a ceremony to physically manifest Paimon. A recent trend in the horror genre is to explore deep psychological complexity. Films such as The Babadook, The Witch, Get Out, and A Quiet Place assemble thoughtful allegories for contemporary anger and despair. These films feel agonizingly real, thus creating an unsettling environment. Hereditary is a social commentary on the representation of U.S. family life and dynamics, intergenerational trauma, spiritualism, and the occultism through the lens of a supernatural story. It expresses the unpredictability of life and how powerless we are to control it, especially in the context of modern America. The cinematography of The Exorcist and Hereditary reflects a trend of growing dissatisfaction with established conventions, often challenging traditional filming technique to embrace darker, more provocative subject matter. With raw documentary-style visuals, the films create a sense of authenticity, amplified by the various camera shot types and dramatic lighting technique. Slow pans in both films build a slow burn anticipation. The camera deliberately creeps around corners and cautiously reveals information, raising suspense and keeping the viewer hooked. Although we expect to see a ghost-like being or paranormal figure, often there is nothing. These slow pans are reminiscent of the character's movement, immersing the viewer in the film and enhancing realism. Sometimes the movement is more subtle and distant, conveying a voyeuristic effect, where we observe as an outsider intruding on the character's most personal moments. This effect is accentuated by the use of wide shots, which contribute to the sinister feeling of the film. The audience lurks in the shadows through the camera, fearing that other beings will follow suit. Similarly, the ultra-wide shots portray a sense of vulnerability and isolation, causing the viewer to feel uncomfortably unfamiliar in what should be a familiar setting. Likewise, the wide shots employed in The Exorcist generate a sense of helplessness and vulnerability, as though we are subject to divine will and powerless to a higher authority.
Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word, and I shall be healed.
This technique amplifies the characters' isolation and despair as they navigate a hauntingly indifferent world. In the two films, lighting and shadows are used intentionally to scare the viewer. What we tried to do, by means of the lighting, was to give it a kind of ominous feeling, as if some lurking, mysterious thing were hanging over it, said the Exorcist cinematographer Owen Roizman. A chiaroscuro lighting technique is often employed to create stark contrast between light and shadow, setting a mood of unease and foreboding. Low-key lighting, particularly in the scenes within the dark, oppressive confines of Reagan's bedroom and the Graham home, adds to the film's sense of claustrophobia. The brain grapples to make sense of the darkness, and the imagination forms figures even when there are none. Conversely, the safe, warm glow of natural light juxtaposes the horror of the supernatural events that unfold on screen. In addition to lighting and camera techniques, these films carefully implement abstract sound design to unsettle viewers using dissonance and otherworldly cacophonies. Ethereal soundscapes evoke images of angels or spirits, while the dark, foreboding melodies signify malevolent forces or haunted spaces and unbearably heighten the viewer's senses. In The Exorcist, the most memorable instance of dynamic sound design is the opening segment set in Iraq. During a time when the Islamic world was villainized by American media, this sequence offers a striking auditory contrast between the Western and Middle Eastern worlds. The layered recordings of the strings, wind, and dogs growling is overwhelming and uncomfortable for the viewer, immediately establishing a menacing, ominous atmosphere. Both scores are disorienting, highlighting a stark contrast between what the viewer expects to feel and what they actually experience, adding a disconcerting hauntedness. The iconic motif of The Exorcist can be heard when Chris McNeil walks through Georgetown on Halloween. Although there is nothing to fear, the music plays high piano notes in a repetitive rhythm, adding uncertainty and apprehension to an otherwise normal scene. In the same way, Hereditary disturbingly ends the Graham's family nightmare with an uplifting, triumphant tone. This music envelops the audience in a therapeutic, harmonic cacophony that is jarring after witnessing the dramatic conclusion. Throughout Hereditary, sustained, low, vibrating tones are contrasted with light, shrill strings. The sharp strings in The Exorcist are reminiscent of human screams, evoking a natural fear in the viewer. The sound design in both films is deeply unnerving, adding to the guttural impact of the horror. Whereas The Exorcist maximizes sound design, Hereditary takes a more minimalist approach. There are often scenes that leave the viewer in silence, allowing the mind to race and absorb the psychological impact of the scene. In both films, the use of sound, or the lack thereof, plays a critical role in developing the supernatural encounters that transcend the genre.
It's the combination of the pigs in a slaughterhouse and 16 variations of a bee in a bottle that mixed together produce a sound that is otherwise impossible to describe.
Another technique not to be overlooked is the skillful editing. Throughout Hereditary, the editing is carefully timed to slow burn anticipation. Shots fluidly and slowly fade from one another, building suspense while managing to keep the viewer engaged, manipulating and distorting the passage of time. The supernatural aspect of both stories is intensified by intercutting horrific imagery and using cross-cutting technique. At one point in The Exorcist, a dream sequence is shown while Father Karras is sleeping. It contains various shots cross-cut to portray an overall feeling of helplessness, displaying human fragility and our fate at the mercy of a higher power. This type of editing also occurs in Hereditary, where the cross-cut between two different characters and location challenges the audience's perception of reality, heightening the tension and mystery. A series of quickly cut shots is shown as the priest attempts to expel the demon. Reagan's room begins to crumble with close-ups of the ceiling cracking, glass breaking, door slamming, and side tables shaking. This intensifies the scene, increases the pace, and stresses the viewer. This chaotic environment is a reflection of the societal and political instability during the period in which The Exorcist was released. Both The Exorcist and Hereditary explore taboo or socially forbidden topics. Stories that would typically send production companies fleeing, directors Friedkin and Astor embrace wholeheartedly. The Exorcist changed the horror genre, be it through storyline, cinematography, sound design, editing, or groundbreaking special effects. It opened the door to the exploration of rarely discussed topics, setting a new standard for horror. Hereditary is, in its own right, one of the most terrifying films of the last decade. Both films were released in periods of fleeting complacency in contemporary America and reflect growing dissatisfaction with traditional conventions. The supernatural phenomena shown in these films create a mysterious, ominous atmosphere that transcend the natural world. While exploring concepts of demonic possession, the impact of faith, and offering shockingly visceral cinematic experiences within the horror genre, these films depict characters that are subject to fate beyond their control, defenseless to divine will and spiritual authority.
demon.